The snow didn't fall. It bit. It tore at her bare feet, shredding skin with every single step. Ayanna didn't walk. She stumbled, a ghost in a landscape of white, wrapped in nothing but a scrap of cloth that smelled of mud and fear. The fabric was so thin, so torn you could see the dark bruises blooming on her skin like poisoned flowers. Her cheek was on fire, her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her arm, it wouldn't stop shaking as she clutched that pathetic rag to her chest. Just hours ago, she'd held a letter, a piece of paper with promises scratched in ink. A man had promised her a future, a home, a life. Instead, he'd locked her in a cabin. His breath was sour, his hands were cruel, and his laughter was the sound of something breaking. When she begged him to stop, he'd leaned in close. "Half-blood," he spat, the word a venomous dart. "No man will ever want you clean." She'd clawed his face. She'd fought like a cornered animal, and then she'd run until her lungs were screaming, until her legs were jelly, until the whole world was just the crunch of snow and the pounding in her ears. The wind howled, slicing right through her. She felt dirty, poisoned, unworthy of the very air she was breathing. Then, through the swirling frost, she saw it, a fence, a dark line drawn against the endless white. Her knees finally gave out. She pitched forward, collapsing onto the frozen earth, the world spinning into darkness. Her lips moved, but no sound came out at first. Then a whisper scraped raw from her throat. "I am not clean," she told the silent falling snow. "I am not clean." But she wasn't alone. The steady rhythm of horses' hooves cut through the wind. A figure emerged from the blizzard, tall and broad in the saddle. He rode hard, pulling his horse to a sharp stop that sent a spray of snow into the air. He swung down with an easy grace, his heavy wool coat making him seem even larger. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes that missed nothing. James Colton froze. He saw the woman. Barefoot, in rags, curled up in the snow like a wounded fawn, trying to disappear into herself. Her eyes were wide, not just with cold, but with a terror so deep it made his own blood run cold. His boots crunched in the snow as he stepped closer. She flinched, turning her face away, hiding behind a curtain of matted hair. "Do not look at me," she begged, her voice a shattered thing. "I'm not clean." For a long moment, there was only the hiss of the wind and the creak of his leather saddle. He didn't move. He just watched her. He saw the bruises. He saw the blood. He saw the shame that was heavier than any winter storm. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he unfastened the buttons on his thick coat. He shrugged it from his shoulders. He bent down, the smell of wood smoke and pine filling the air around her. He draped the coat over her trembling body. It was heavy. It was warm. It covered her in a way her own hands could not. "I do not care about dirt," he said, his voice low and rough like stones rolling in a riverbed. "I see someone still alive, and that is enough." Her throat closed up. She'd expected him to recoil in disgust, to shout at her, to ride away and leave her to the wolves. But this stranger... He gave her back a piece of her dignity. A tiny flicker of something she thought was dead and buried sparked to life deep inside her chest. He offered a hand. It was calloused and strong, but his grip was gentle as he helped her to her feet. The world swayed, but he held her steady. Snow drifted around them, swallowing the stars. Wrapped in his coat, she felt the first real warmth she had known in what felt like a lifetime. Each step toward the distant light of his ranch was a step into the unknown. But for the first time since she'd burst from that cabin, the unknown didn't feel like a monster waiting in the dark. It felt, strangely, like a chance. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he would do when he learned the whole ugly truth. But as the outline of a small cabin grew clearer, a voice cut through the night. It was high and clear as a bell. "Papa, who is that?" A child stood on the porch, bathed in the golden glow of a lantern. She couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Her hair was the color of spun gold, and she clutched a small rag doll in her tiny hands. Her wide, curious eyes were fixed on the strange woman wearing her father's coat. The little girl tilted her head, and in a voice that carried the weight of the whole world, she asked a question that would change everything. "Do you think she could be my mama?" The words hit the cold night air and shattered the silence. They hung there, between the falling snow and the frozen ground, between a broken woman and a guarded man. The ranch house smelled of wood smoke and beef stew, the kind of smell that sinks into the wooden walls and makes a house a home. James guided Ayanna inside, his heavy coat still a protective weight on her shoulders. She kept her eyes glued to the floorboards, too ashamed to look at him, too terrified that the little girl's question would shatter what was left of her heart. The child, Emmy, padded barefoot across the floor. She tugged on her father's pant leg, her gaze never leaving Ayanna. "Papa," she said again, her voice soft but certain. "I just want a mama." She said it so simply. Not a demand, not a whine, just a plain fact, stated by a child who had known a loneliness too big for her small body. Ayanna's throat felt like it was full of gravel. She wanted to scream that she was the wrong person, that she was broken goods, that no child, especially not this one with eyes like a summer sky, should ever want a mother like her. But Emmy just stared, her expression open and honest, waiting for an answer. James knelt, placing a rough hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Emmy, girl," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We don't ask strangers for things like that." Then his eyes lifted to meet Ayanna's. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable. He was trying to piece her together, to understand the storm that had washed her up on his doorstep. For a split second, Ayanna thought about lying. She could invent a story. A runaway horse, a wrong turn in the snow, something easy, something clean. But lies have a way of unraveling. And this man, with his steady, quiet gaze, didn't seem like the kind of man who had any patience for them. So she told him the truth, or part of it. "I came here because of a letter," she began, her voice cracking. Her fingers twisted in the thick wool of his coat, the only thing holding her up. "A man. He promised me a home, a place I could finally belong." James didn't say a word. He just listened. The silence in the cabin was so complete, you could hear the fire crackling in the hearth. Ayanna forced the next words out. "He tricked me. He touched me when I told him no. He called me half-blood. He said no one would ever want me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "So I ran. I ran until I couldn't run anymore." The truth filled the small room, heavy and suffocating. She felt his eyes on her, and she braced for the judgment, for the cold order to get out. But the judgment never came. Instead, it was the little girl who spoke. Emmy tilted her head, her golden curls bouncing. "You ran away because he was mean," she said. It was so simple, so pure. The child's words sliced through all of Ayanna's shame and cut right to the heart of it. He was mean. Ayanna's lips trembled. "Yes, sweetheart. He was mean." She finally looked up at James, expecting to see disgust on his face. Pity, anger, something. Instead, he turned, poured water from a bucket into a tin cup, and set it on the table in front of her. "Drink," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a quiet command. There was no pity in his voice, no softness, just a steady, grounding presence. And for the first time since clawing her way out of that monster's cabin, Ayanna did what she was told without an ounce of fear. She drank. Emmy climbed onto her father's lap, her thumb finding its way into her mouth as she watched the strange woman. "Papa," she mumbled around her thumb. "Can she stay? Just for tonight?" James was quiet for a long time. His gaze drifted from Ayanna's face to the dark bruises peeking out from the collar of his coat. He saw the dirt, the exhaustion, the terror, but he also saw something else. a flicker of fight that hadn't been extinguished, a fire that was still burning, even if it was just embers. Then he gave a single, slow nod. A breath Ayanna didn't even know she'd been holding escaped her lungs in a shaky rush. That one small nod felt more significant than any promise written on paper. It was the first stone being laid in a foundation she never thought she'd have. But she had no idea what was really happening. She thought she'd stumbled into a quiet harbor after a terrible storm. She was wrong. She had just walked into the eye of the hurricane, and the man who had given her his coat was the reason the storm was coming for them all. The man she had run from, Silas Croft, wasn't just some random brute. He was a predator who had been circling this very ranch for months. James Colton's land, with its precious river access, was the final piece in a puzzle Silas was determined to complete. He'd been buying up all the surrounding properties, using threats and trickery, squeezing James from all sides. The letter he'd sent to Ayanna hadn't been a simple proposal. It was a lie wrapped in a trap. He never intended to marry her. He intended to use her, to break her, and to set up a homestead on a disputed piece of land that bordered James's property, giving him a legal foothold to challenge James's claim. Ayanna wasn't just a victim. She was a pawn in a war she knew nothing about. As she sipped the cool water, James watched her, his mind racing. He recognized the details of her story. He'd heard whispers in town about Silas Croft and his mail-order brides, women who arrived full of hope and then simply disappeared. He stood up and walked to the single window, peering out into the swirling snow. "What was his name?" James asked, his back still to her. "Silas," she whispered. "Silas Croft." James's shoulders tensed. He turned around slowly, and for the first time, Ayanna saw something other than quiet strength in his eyes. She saw a cold, hard fury. "Croft," he repeated, the name tasting like poison. "He's been a thorn in my side since spring, trying to claim the water rights to the south pasture." Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place for Ayanna. The land Silas had shown her on a crude map. It was right next to a winding creek. Her presence here wasn't an accident. Her escape to this specific ranch wasn't a coincidence. It was a disaster. "He'll come looking for me," she said, the realization dawning on her. The cup trembled in her hands. "He won't just be looking for you," James said, his voice grim. "You're not just a runaway. You're a witness. You're proof of what he is." The warmth from the fire suddenly felt like a lie. The sturdy walls of the cabin felt like paper. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a target. And by stumbling here, she had painted a giant red X right on James and his little girl. Emmy, sensing the shift in the room, burrowed deeper into her father's arms. "Papa, is the mean man coming here?" James looked down at his daughter, his expression softening for a moment. He smoothed her hair. "No, Emmy girl, I won't let any mean men in this house." But as he looked back at Ayanna, his eyes held a different message. It wasn't a promise of safety, it was a declaration of war. He hadn't just offered a stranger shelter for the night. He had just recruited a soldier. And the battle for this small patch of land, for their very lives, was about to begin. The quiet days that followed were a lie. On the surface, a fragile routine took hold. Ayanna cooked. She mended a tear in one of Emmy's dresses. She swept the floorboards until they were clean. She moved like a phantom through the small cabin, trying to make herself useful, trying to earn the sanctuary she had been given. But underneath the quiet hum of domestic life, there was a current of humming tension. James started spending his days not just mending fences, but reinforcing them. He cleaned his rifle every single night by the fire, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism a constant reminder of the threat that lay just beyond their sight. He began to teach her. "You need to know how to use this," he said one afternoon, pressing the cold, heavy weight of a pistol into her hands. Her first instinct was to drop it, to recoil from the very idea of it. The only violence she'd known was as a victim. "I can't," she whispered. "You will," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He stood behind her, his hands guiding hers, showing her how to stand, how to aim, how to control her breathing. "You don't get to be helpless out here. Helpless gets you killed." Every day was a lesson. He taught her how to track, how to spot a man trying to hide on a ridgeline. He taught her which sounds the forest made when it was calm, and which sounds it made when something was wrong. She was a quick study. The terror that had nearly paralyzed her was slowly being forged into something else. A hard, sharp-edged resolve. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor. Emmy, oblivious to the true danger, was her constant shadow. The little girl followed Ayanna everywhere, her chatter a bright thread in the heavy silence. She'd bring Ayanna wildflowers she'd found poking through the snow. She'd ask questions about the strange, beautiful beads Ayanna kept in a small leather pouch. "My mother made them," Ayanna explained one day, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns. It was the first time she'd spoken of her family. "Is she a princess?" Emmy asked, her eyes wide with wonder. A sad smile touched Ayanna's lips. "No, little one. She was just a woman who knew how to make beautiful things. A woman who had been taken from her too soon in a raid that had shattered her world long before Silas Croft ever entered it. The bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. Ayanna would find herself humming old lullabies from her tribe as she brushed Emmy's golden hair. Emmy would fall asleep with her head in Ayanna's lap. They were starting to look like a family. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Because love makes you vulnerable. Love gives your enemies leverage. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, James spotted it. A flicker of movement on the far ridge. He grabbed his spyglass, his knuckles white. It was a rider, sitting on his horse, just watching the cabin. He was too far away to make out his face, but they both knew who he worked for. Silas was sending a message. "I know where you are." That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It wasn't tense anymore. It was brittle, ready to shatter. "He's not going to give up," Ayanna said, staring into the fire. "Neither am I," James replied, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. The scout on the ridge was just the beginning. A probe, a test of their defenses. The real attack was coming, and it wouldn't be with guns. It would be far more insidious, far more cruel. Silas Croft wasn't a man who believed in fair fights. He was a snake who preferred to use venom. And he had just found the perfect way to inject it directly into the heart of their home. The attack came not with a bang, but with a cough. One morning, Emmy woke up flushed and listless. By noon, she was burning with a fever that made her small body tremble. Her breaths were shallow, her eyes glassy. James was a man who could face down a blizzard, a rustler, or a charging bull without flinching. But this undid him. He paced the small cabin like a caged animal, his face a mask of raw panic. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice tight with a fear Ayanna had never heard before. "The town doctor is a 3-hour ride, and with this snow—" The town doctor. The name sent a chill down Ayanna's spine. A few weeks ago, before she'd arrived, Emmy had a small cold. James had mentioned taking her to see Dr. Miller, a man he described as competent, if not particularly friendly. A man who was known to play cards with Silas Croft at the saloon. A terrible suspicion began to form in Ayanna's mind. "Let me see her," she said, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her own heart. She pushed past James and knelt by the small cot where Emmy lay. She felt the girl's forehead. It was like touching a hot stove. "My father was a medicine man," she said softly, more to herself than to James. "I know these things." James froze, watching her. He was a man of logic, of fences and finance. He didn't put much stock in tribal remedies, but he was also a desperate father. "Do what you have to do," he said, his voice hoarse. Ayanna flew into action. She pulled her small leather pouch from her satchel, the one with her mother's beads. But inside, nestled among the keepsakes, were dried herbs, roots, and powders, carefully wrapped in scraps of cloth. The knowledge of her people, passed down through generations. She crushed roots, boiled water, and filled the cabin with the sharp, earthy smells of her ancestral medicine. Her hands were sure, her movements precise. She coaxed the delirious child to sip a bitter, dark tea. She soaked cloths in a cool infusion and laid them on Emmy's forehead, whispering words in a language James didn't understand. They were not prayers. They were commands. Commands for the fever to break, for the spirit to fight. As she worked, she noticed a small, half-empty bottle of tonic on the bedside table. "Dr. Miller's fever reducer," the label read. "This," she asked, holding it up. "What is it?" "The doctor gave it to me last month for her cough," James explained. "He said to give her a spoonful if she ever felt poorly again." Ayanna uncorked the bottle and sniffed. The smell was faint, almost unnoticeable beneath the sweet syrup. But it was there. Nightshade. Not enough to kill quickly, but enough to build up in a small body over time. Enough to weaken the heart, to invite in a fever that would not break. It wasn't a fever. It was a poisoning. Silas hadn't sent a gunman. He'd sent a doctor. He wasn't trying to scare James. He was trying to take the one thing that would break him completely, his daughter. The hours crawled by. James sat in a chair in the corner, his rifle across his lap, watching the woman he'd taken in fight a battle he couldn't comprehend. He watched her wage war against an invisible enemy, using weapons he couldn't see. Just before dawn, something shifted. The frantic trembling in Emmy's body stilled. A deep sigh escaped her lips. The fever, like a stubborn tide, finally began to recede. Emmy curled onto her side, her small hand reaching out in her sleep until it found Ayanna's. She held on tight, as if she were anchoring herself to life. Ayanna slumped against the cot, utterly spent. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the sound of a child's even breathing. James looked at Ayanna, his gaze cutting through the dim light. He saw the exhaustion etched on her face, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes. He saw a woman who carried more strength in her scars than any man he had ever known. He finally understood. Silas Croft wasn't just trying to take his land. He was trying to erase his future. And this woman, this half-blood stranger who had stumbled out of the snow, was the only thing standing in his way. He walked over to the table and picked up the doctor's tonic bottle. He stared at it for a long moment, his knuckles turning white. Then, with a sudden, violent movement, he hurled it into the fireplace. The glass exploded in a shower of sparks. The truce was over. The line had been crossed. This was no longer about property. It was about blood. The breaking of the fever did not bring peace. It brought a cold, terrifying clarity. They were living in a fortress, and the enemy had already breached the walls. James was a storm cloud ready to burst. All he wanted to do was ride into town and drag Dr. Miller out into the street. He wanted to ride to Silas Croft's homestead and burn it to the ground. He was a man of action, and the slow, insidious nature of this attack was driving him mad. "That's what he wants," Ayanna told him, her voice quiet but firm. She stood between him and the door, her small frame a surprising obstacle. "He wants you to lose your head. He wants you to ride in there, guns blazing, so the sheriff has a reason to lock you up or put you in the ground. Then the ranch and Emmy are his for the taking." He stopped, the fury in his eyes warring with the logic in her words. She was right. He was playing Silas's game. "So we do nothing?" he growled, the frustration palpable. "We just wait for him to try again?" "No," Ayanna said, her eyes glinting in the firelight. We don't wait. We prepare, and we find proof that no one can deny. Their dynamic shifted. She was no longer just a refugee he was protecting. She was a strategist, a partner. Her perspective, born from a life of seeing threats where others saw none, was now their greatest weapon. The proof lay in the ashes. The next morning, Ayanna carefully sifted through the fireplace until she found a warped shard of the tonic bottle. A small amount of the dark, sticky liquid still clung to it. "There's a plant," she explained, holding the shard up to the light. "My people call it shadow root. It looks harmless, but the root, when boiled down, it mimics a fever. It weakens the body from the inside out. It's a coward's poison." They had the weapon. But it wasn't enough. As James had said, who would take the word of a half-blood woman over a respected town doctor? They needed more. They needed to make Silas overplay his hand, and Silas, impatient and arrogant, was about to do just that. A few days later, a fragile sense of normalcy had returned. Emmy, weak but recovering, was laughing in the small yard, chasing a butterfly that had foolishly emerged in a moment of winter sun. James was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of the axe a reassuring heartbeat for the ranch. Ayanna was hanging blankets on the line, the clean scent of soap and sunshine a small act of defiance against the darkness that surrounded them. It almost felt like a family. It almost felt safe. That's when the attack came. It started with a sudden, unnatural quiet. The birds stopped singing. The wind died down. Ayanna's head snapped up, her senses screaming that something was wrong. She called Emmy's name. No answer. Her eyes shot to the creek at the edge of the property. The gate, which James always kept latched, was swinging gently in the breeze. Her blood ran cold. She ran, skirts flying, bare feet pounding against the cold, hard dirt. She didn't feel the sharp stones or the frozen mud. She just ran towards the sound of the water. She saw the small footprints leading down the muddy bank. And then she heard it. A splash, followed by a terrified, high-pitched scream. Emmy was in the water. The creek, swollen and fast-moving from the melting snow, was pulling her under. Her little arms were flailing, her face a pale blur in the churning, icy current. Her rag doll floated away, a lonely sentinel on the fast-moving water. "Hold on!" Ayanna screamed, not even thinking. She plunged into the freezing water, the shock of it stealing her breath. It was like being stabbed by 1,000 knives. But she pushed forward, her eyes locked on the little girl. She reached for Emmy, her numb fingers slipping on the wet wool of the child's coat. She lunged again, grabbing a fistful of fabric and shoving Emmy towards a large rock that jutted out from the middle of the stream. "Stay there!" she gasped, her teeth chattering. "Don't you let go!" Emmy clung to the rock, her small body racked with sobs. Ayanna tried to pull herself out, but her foot was caught. A sharp, searing pain shot up her leg. Her ankle was wedged tight between two heavy stones at the bottom of the creek bed. She twisted. She pulled. Nothing. The current was a relentless monster, pulling at her, dragging her down, sapping her strength. The world was starting to go gray at the edges. That's when she saw him. Not James. A man standing on the opposite bank, half hidden by the trees. One of Silas's men. The same man she'd seen on the ridge. He was just watching, a cruel smirk on his face. He had opened the gate. He had lured Emmy to the water. This was no accident. It was an execution. Her strength was gone. The cold was a heavy blanket, pulling her down into the darkness. Then another sound. Boots pounding on the frozen ground. James. He'd heard the screams. He took in the scene in a fraction of a second. His daughter, sobbing on a rock. Ayanna, her head barely above water, going limp in the current. The man on the far bank, already melting back into the shadows. James didn't hesitate. He launched himself into the creek, the icy water a brutal shock. He ignored the cold, the current, everything but the two people who had become his entire world. He wrenched Ayana's foot free from the rocks, the sickening pop of bone barely registering. Then he grabbed Emmy, tucking her small, shivering body under one arm. He hauled them both back to the bank, his own body shaking violently from the cold and the adrenaline. Back inside the cabin, he worked with a frantic urgency. He stripped their wet clothes off, wrapped them in every blanket he owned, and pulled them both close to the roaring fire. He held Ayana tight against his chest, trying to force his own body heat into her. "Stay with me," he whispered, his voice cracking. He repeated it over and over, a desperate prayer. "Ayana, don't you leave me now." Hours passed. The sky outside turned a bruised purple, then black. Finally, her eyelids fluttered. Her lips were blue, her voice a reedy whisper. But the first word she spoke wasn't about the cold or the pain in her ankle. "Emmy?" "She's safe," James choked out, his relief so profound it felt like a physical blow. "She's safe, because of you." Ayana closed her eyes, and a single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "I saw him," she whispered. "One of Silas's men. He was watching." James's jaw clenched so tight it ached. He bowed his head, his rough hands trembling as he held hers. He had almost lost everything. He had almost let his caution, his desire for proof, cost him the lives of his daughter and the woman who had saved her. That night, as the fire burned low, the three of them huddled together under a mountain of blankets. It no longer felt like three broken people clinging to each other for survival. It felt like a promise, a silent vow made in the face of death. But the night wasn't over. Just as a fragile warmth began to settle in the cabin, they heard it. The sound of multiple horses approaching. Not stealthily. They were riding hard, making no effort to conceal their arrival. James was on his feet in an instant, his rifle in his hands. He peered through the small crack in the shutters. It wasn't a raiding party. It was worse. Silas Croft sat on a fine black horse, a smug look of triumph on his face. And beside him, wearing a silver star on his chest, was the town sheriff. Silas hadn't come with guns. He had come with the law. "James Colton," the sheriff's voice boomed, cutting through the cold night air. "I have a warrant for the woman you're harboring. A warrant for the arrest of Ayana of the Red Creek people on the charge of theft." The accusation was so absurd, it was brilliant. Silas wasn't accusing her of being a runaway. He was painting her as a common thief. It was a charge the town would understand, a crime they would condone punishing. "What did he say you stole?" James asked, his voice a low growl, never taking his eyes off the men outside. Ayana's mind raced. What could he possibly claim? Then she remembered. In her haste to flee his cabin, she had grabbed her small satchel. Inside, among her herbs and personal items, was the only thing of value she owned. A silver-backed hairbrush, a gift from the white missionary who had taught her to read and write. It was old and tarnished, but it was hers. "A hairbrush," she whispered, the sickness rising in her throat. "He's claiming I stole a silver hairbrush." Silas was twisting everything. He was turning her escape into a crime. He was using her own meager possessions as a weapon against her. "He's a liar!" James roared through the door. "That's for the judge to decide," the sheriff called back, his voice oozing false authority. "Silas Croft here says the brush was a family heirloom, says he took you in, gave you shelter, and you robbed him blind. Now send her out, James. Don't make this difficult." Difficult was an understatement. This was a checkmate. If James refused, he would be charged with obstructing justice. They could take him, take Ayana, and Emmy would be left alone, vulnerable, an orphan for the state to manage, and for a man like Silas Croft to manipulate. If he handed Ayana over, he would be sending her to her death. There would be no trial. Silas would make sure she never spoke a word of what he did to her. They were trapped. The law, The one thing that was supposed to protect the innocent was being wielded like a club. James looked at Ayanna. Her face was pale in the firelight, but her eyes were blazing. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fury that matched his own. She wasn't the broken woman who had collapsed in the snow anymore. "He keeps a book," she said, her voice low and urgent. "A ledger. In his office. I saw him writing in it. Names, dates, amounts of money. He bragged about it. Said it was a record of all the fools he'd bested." A ledger. A record of his crimes. In his own hand. It was the only thing that could save them. The only thing that could burn Silas's whole corrupt world to the ground. "His office is in the main house behind the saloon he owns in town," James thought aloud, his mind already working, calculating. "No," Ayanna said, shaking her head. "Not anymore. The night I ran away. He was packing. He said he was moving everything out to his new homestead, the one he built on the land he stole. The same cabin where he had attacked her. The ledger was there, in the one place on earth she never wanted to see again." "Sheriff!" James shouted, buying them time. "You're not taking anyone tonight. You come back at sunrise. You have my word. We will be here." There was a long pause. A muffled conversation between Silas and the sheriff. They were confident. They thought they had him cornered. "Sunrise, Colton," the sheriff finally yelled back. "Don't try anything stupid." The sound of their horses faded into the night, leaving a silence that was more terrifying than the confrontation itself. They had until sunrise. One night to turn the tables, one night to find the proof that would either set them free or get them all killed. "I have to go back," Ayanna said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. "No," James said immediately. "It's too dangerous. I'll go." "You can't," she argued, her voice gaining strength. "You've never seen the inside of that cabin. I have. I know where he worked. I know the loose floorboard in the corner where he kept his whiskey. If he has a hiding place, it will be near there. You would waste too much time searching." "Time we don't have." He stared at her, a war raging within him. Every protective instinct screamed at him to lock her in the cabin and face Silas himself. But he knew she was right. Her knowledge was their only advantage. "I'll create a diversion," he said, his voice grim. "There's a dry canyon north of his homestead. I'll start a brush fire. A big one. It'll look like a signal fire, or an attack. With any luck, it will draw him and his men out of the cabin to investigate." "It has to work," Ayanna said. "We only get one chance." They moved quickly, the adrenaline pushing away their exhaustion and fear. James gave her his sharpest hunting knife. He blackened her face with soot from the fireplace to help her blend into the shadows. As she stood by the door, ready to slip out into the darkness, he grabbed her arm. "Ayanna," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't have to do this. We can still run." She looked at him, then at Emmy, who was sleeping peacefully by the fire, blissfully unaware of the storm about to break over their heads. "I've been running my whole life," she said, her voice shaking slightly but her resolve like iron. "From the men who destroyed my village. From the shame of being a half-blood in a white world. I ran from that cabin once to save my life. Tonight I'm running back to claim one." She slipped out of the door and was swallowed by the night. The ride was a nightmare. The cold air burned her lungs, and every jolt of the horse sent a fresh wave of agony through her injured ankle. But she pushed it down. Pain was a luxury she couldn't afford. She tethered the horse in a thicket of trees a quarter-mile from the homestead, and moved the rest of the way on foot, a silent shadow flitting between the rocks and trees. The cabin was a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. A single lamp burned in the window. He was in there, waiting for morning, waiting for his victory. She crouched behind a pile of firewood, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched. She waited. Time stretched and warped. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sounded like an army approaching. Then, in the distance, a faint orange glow appeared on the horizon. James's fire. It grew quickly, a brilliant, angry bloom against the black canvas of the night sky. The cabin door flew open. Silas Croft stood on the porch staring at the fire. He yelled something back into the house, and two more men emerged. There was a frantic exchange of words. They were confused, worried. "It could be Colton's men," she heard one of them say. "Colton doesn't have any men," Silas snarled. "Go check it out, both of you, now!" The two men scrambled to their horses and rode off towards the fire, their figures quickly disappearing into the darkness. But Silas didn't follow. He stood on the porch, his shotgun cradled in his arms, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the homestead. He was suspicious. He wasn't taking the bait completely. This was her only chance. He was distracted, his attention focused on the hills. She took a deep breath, clutching the handle of the hunting knife, and she ran. She moved with a speed she didn't know she possessed, a blur of motion across the cleared ground between the woods and the cabin. She went around the back, to the small, grimy window of the room where he had kept her, the window he had nailed shut. Using the butt of the knife, she worked on the nails, her movements quick and quiet. The wood groaned in protest. One nail came loose, then another. She held her breath, listening. Silas was still on the front porch. She pried the window open just enough to squeeze through and dropped silently to the floor inside. The room smelled of him. Stale whiskey and sweat and cruelty. Bile rose in her throat, but she forced it down. She couldn't fall apart. Not now. She crept into the main room. It was empty. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers. Through the front window, she could see Silas's silhouette as he paced on the porch. She moved to the corner she remembered, the loose floorboard. Her fingers scrabbled at the edges, finding the small groove. She lifted it. There was no whiskey. Instead, there was a small locked metal box. Her heart leaped. This had to be it, but it was locked. She tried to pry it open with the knife, but the lock was solid. She needed a key. Where would he keep a key? She scanned the room, a small desk littered with maps and papers, a rack of rifles against the wall, a coat thrown over a chair. The coat. She tiptoed over to it, her eyes darting to the window. Silas was still outside. She reached into the pockets, nothing but a tin of tobacco and some loose coins. She was about to turn away when her fingers brushed against something hard, sewn into the lining of the collar. A small, flat key. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely fit it into the lock. It clicked. She lifted the lid, and there it was, a thick, leather-bound ledger. She opened it. His neat, precise handwriting filled the pages. Names, dates, bribes paid to Dr. Miller, payments to the sheriff, and detailed accounts of how he had systematically swindled a dozen families out of their land. It was all there. More proof than she could have ever dreamed of. She tucked the ledger under her arm and started to move back towards the small window. She was almost there. Almost free. And then the front door creaked open. She froze, every muscle in her body screaming. Silas stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He hadn't seen her yet. She pressed herself into the darkest corner of the room, barely daring to breathe. He walked over to the fireplace, muttering to himself about the fire. He kicked at a log, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Then he stopped, his head tilted, like an animal sensing a change in the air. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the room. His eyes passed right over her. And then they snapped back. They locked onto the open window. A slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. "Look what the cat dragged back in." He took a step towards her, raising the shotgun. "I knew you'd come back for your little trinkets, but I didn't expect you to bring me the one thing I was missing." His eyes weren't on her. They were on the ledger tucked under her arm. "I was going to have to burn that book," he said, taking another step. "A necessary loss. But now I get the book, And I get to finish what we started. The chase was on. It wasn't a panicked flight through the snow. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse in the confines of the cabin. She darted away as he lunged, the desk crashing to the floor. Papers scattered everywhere. She scrambled into the small bedroom, the only other room in the cabin, and slammed the door, fumbling with the lock. The wood shuddered as he threw his weight against it from the other side. "There's nowhere to run, you filthy half-breed," he roared. The lock wouldn't hold. She looked around frantically. There was no other exit. Just a single small window boarded up from the outside. She was trapped. The door splintered. She clutched the heavy ledger to her chest. This book was their only hope. She couldn't let him get it. With a final brutal crash, the door flew open. Silas stood there, his face contorted with rage, his eyes promising a world of pain. He lunged for her. She dodged, using the survival instincts James had drilled into her. She kicked over a small table, trying to put something, anything, between them. He backhanded her across the face, the force of it sending her sprawling to the floor. The ledger flew from her grasp, sliding across the floorboards and coming to a stop near the doorway. He loomed over her, a triumphant sneer on his face. It's over. But it wasn't. Because through the broken doorway, another figure appeared, silhouetted against the night. James. He hadn't just set the fire. He had circled back, anticipating that Silas might be too clever to fall for the trick completely. Silas spun around, his eyes wide with shock. For a split second, he was caught off guard. And a split second was all James needed. He moved with the speed and fury of a striking predator. It wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. James didn't just hit him. He dismantled him. The rage he'd been suppressing for weeks, the terror of almost losing his daughter, the fury at what this man had done to Ayanna, it all came pouring out. Silas, so used to being the predator, was now the prey. He was no match for the raw, righteous fury of a man defending his family. When it was over, Silas was a broken heap on the floor. James stood over him, his chest heaving. He turned to Ayanna, his eyes searching her face. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, pushing herself up. She crawled over to the ledger and clutched it to her chest. "I have it," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "I have it all." As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, they rode back to the Colton ranch. Behind them, Silas Croft's homestead was engulfed in flames. Not James's diversionary fire, a new one that had started with a well-placed lantern in a pile of dry hay. They didn't just take the proof, they erased the place of her torment from the face of the earth. When they arrived back at the ranch, the sheriff and his 2 deputies were there, waiting, their horses stomping impatiently in the cold morning air. "All right, Colton," the sheriff said, his voice full of smug authority. "Time's up. Send out the thief." James swung down from his horse. He walked calmly towards the sheriff, his face like stone. Ayanna followed, her chin held high, the ledger held tightly in her hands. "There's been a change of plans, Sheriff," James said, his voice dangerously quiet. He opened the ledger. He started to read. He read about the bribes. He read about the poisoned tonic Dr. Miller had provided. He read about the plan to abduct Emmy at the creek. He read about the sheriff's own complicity, the payments he had accepted to look the other way. The sheriff's face went from smug to confused to ghost white. His deputies began to back their horses away, their eyes wide. When James was finished, the silence was absolute. "Now," James said, his voice like the crack of a whip, "you have 2 choices. You can ride out of here and never come back, or you can try and arrest this woman, and I will burn you all to the ground." The sheriff didn't need to be told a 3rd time. He spurred his horse and fled, his deputies right behind him. Justice hadn't come from a judge or a jury. It had come from a leather-bound book and the courage of 2 people who refused to break. The morning after the fire, the ranch was still. The world was blanketed in a fresh layer of pure, white snow. It felt like the land had been cleansed, wiped clean. Inside the cabin, a peaceful quiet reigned. Emmy, finally safe, was curled up on the cot, asleep between her father and the woman who had become her fierce protector. Her small hand was tucked into Ayana's palm, a perfect fit. When Ayana opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the little girl, now awake, watching her with those big, solemn blue eyes. "Can you be my mama forever?" Emmy whispered, the question soft as a prayer. It was the same question she had asked on that first, terrible night. But this time, Ayana didn't flinch. The shame was gone, burned away in the fires of the last 24 hours. She pulled the child into a hug, burying her face in the girl's soft, golden hair. "Yes, baby," she choked out, her voice thick with tears. "If you'll have me, I will." From across the room, James watched them, his heart so full he felt it might burst. He was a man who had boarded up the windows to his own heart, sworn he would never let anyone in again after his wife had passed. But this woman, she hadn't just knocked. She had kicked the door down. Later, they stood on the porch together, watching the snow fall. The air was crisp and clean. "I don't have much," James said, his voice low and steady. He wasn't a man for fancy words. "This land, this cabin, not much else. No rings, no preacher." He turned to look at her, and his eyes held a truth more powerful than any vow. "But if what you want is a home, if what you need is to not be alone, then I have that. I have her." He paused, his throat working. "And I want to have you, too." Tears welled in Ayana's eyes, but for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Not shame, not fear, not sorrow, belonging. "I don't just want a roof, James," she said, her voice soft but strong. "I want a family." And on that cold winter day, under a sky the color of pearl, 3 broken souls stopped being broken. They fit their jagged edges together and became whole. They hadn't found a family in bloodlines or promises written on paper. They had forged one, in fire, in fear, and finally, in love. They chose each other. Maybe you believe that's how real families are made, not just by chance, but by choice, that the deepest scars can sometimes lead us to the very people we were meant to find all along. If this story reminded you that even in the harshest winter, a new life can begin, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We believe these stories of the heart forged in the wild frontiers of this country deserve to be told. Because you never know when the next person to stumble out of the snow might just change your life forever.